The reservation confirmation email was still glowing on my laptop screen when I heard David's voice drifting from the kitchen, low and intimate in a way that made my stomach clench. He was on the phone again, speaking in those hushed tones that had become increasingly frequent over the past 6 months. The words I caught made my blood run cold. "Don't worry, Amanda. Everything's going to work out perfectly tonight." Amanda, his secretary, on the evening of our 8th wedding anniversary. I closed my laptop slowly, my marketing director instincts already cataloging the inconsistencies I'd been ignoring for months. The late nights at MedCore Pharmaceuticals that never seemed to correlate with actual client meetings. The new cologne that appeared in our bathroom without explanation. The way David's phone had suddenly acquired a lock screen when it had never needed one before. Tonight was supposed to be our celebration. 8 years of marriage, commemorating the same date he'd proposed to me at this very restaurant. Alinea, Chicago's crown jewel of fine dining, where a reservation required 3 months of planning and cost more than most people's rent. I'd booked this dinner believing we were celebrating our love story. Instead, I was apparently hosting the premiere of my husband's betrayal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Martinez, and 6 months ago, I thought I had everything figured out. At 34, I'd clawed my way up from an entry-level marketing assistant to director of digital strategy at TechFlow Solutions, one of Chicago's fastest-growing B2B software companies. My corner office on the 25th floor of the Willis Tower offered a view of Lake Michigan that never failed to remind me how far I'd come from the cramped apartment in Pilsen, where I'd grown up with my sister Maria and our single mother. David and I had met at a professional networking event 8 years ago, both of us young and hungry, and convinced we could conquer the world together. He was charming in that effortless way that made clients trust him immediately, his pharmaceutical. Sales numbers consistently placing him in the top tier at MedCore. I was the analytical one, the strategist who could spot market trends and consumer patterns that others missed. We complemented each other perfectly, or so I believed. Our Lincoln Park townhouse was the physical manifestation of our shared success. 3 bedrooms we'd planned to fill with children someday, a kitchen where David would cook elaborate meals on weekends while I worked on presentations that would secure our next big client. The mortgage stretched us financially, but we were building something together. Every payment felt like an investment in our future. That future felt increasingly fragile as I listened to David end his call with promises that sent ice through my veins. "I'll see you soon," delivered in a tone I recognized as the one he'd once used exclusively for me. When he appeared in our living room, straightening his tie and checking his reflection in the hallway mirror, he looked every inch the successful sales executive preparing for an important client dinner. "Ready for our big night?" he asked, his smile bright and seemingly genuine. 8 years of marriage had taught me to read his expressions, but tonight something felt carefully constructed about his enthusiasm. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. I studied his face, searching for tells the way I analyzed consumer data looking for patterns others missed. The slight tension around his eyes, the way his hand moved automatically to check his phone when he thought I wasn't watching. The cologne that definitely wasn't the Tom Ford I'd bought him for Christmas. "David," I said carefully, "who were you just talking to?" His pause lasted exactly 2 beats too long. "Client call. You know how it is in pharma. Doctors keep crazy hours. Had to confirm some details for next week's presentation." The lie came so smoothly that I almost believed it. Almost. But my marketing brain was already dissecting the inconsistencies. Doctors didn't typically take calls at 7 p.m. on Saturday nights. Client presentations weren't usually discussed, in the hushed, intimate tones I'd overheard. And clients definitely weren't named Amanda Foster. Yes, I knew exactly who Amanda Foster was. 26 years old, recent Northwestern graduate, executive assistant to David's entire sales team. Blonde, ambitious, and possessed of the kind of eager enthusiasm that made senior management notice her contributions during meetings. David had mentioned her frequently over the past 6 months, always in professional contexts, always with just a touch more admiration than seemed strictly necessary. "The new assistant is really something," he'd say after particularly successful client presentations. Amanda has this way of anticipating what clients need before they even know it themselves. I'd noticed how his face lit up when he talked about her insights, the same expression he'd once reserved for discussing my own professional achievements. The drive to Alinea passed in carefully orchestrated small talk. David chatted about his latest sales numbers, the upcoming holiday party at MedCore, our plans for Thanksgiving with Maria and her family in Naperville. Normal conversation that felt like stage direction, each topic carefully chosen to avoid the undercurrents neither of us was willing to acknowledge. Chicago's November chill bit through my coat as we walked from the parking garage to the restaurant. I'd chosen my outfit carefully for tonight, a deep burgundy dress that David had always said brought out the gold flecks in my brown eyes. My grandmother's pearl necklace, the one I wore for special occasions and job interviews, and moments when I needed to feel connected to the strong women who'd shaped me. Looking back, I realize I was unconsciously armoring myself for battle. Alinea's interior wrapped around us like an expensive embrace. All clean lines and dramatic lighting designed to make every meal feel like a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Our table overlooked the main dining room, positioned perfectly for the theater of high-end cuisine that was about to unfold. The maitre d' recognized us from our engagement dinner 8 years ago, his smile warm with the kind of personal attention that made the astronomical prices feel almost reasonable. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen," he said, using the hyphenated surname I'd never legally adopted, but that David preferred for social situations. "Congratulations on your anniversary. We've prepared something special for this evening." David's smile seemed genuine as he thanked the staff, his hand finding mine across the table in a gesture that felt both familiar and foreign. For a moment, I allowed myself to wonder if I'd been wrong. If the phone call had been exactly what he claimed, if the distance I'd been feeling was just the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage, if my marketing mind was finding patterns where none existed, then Amanda Foster walked through the front door. She spotted our table immediately, her face lighting up with what appeared to be genuine surprise and delight. 26 years old and stunning in the way that only comes from youth and confidence, wearing a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Her blonde hair was styled in loose waves that caught the restaurant's dramatic lighting perfectly, and her smile was the kind that made servers and maitre d's compete for her attention. "David!" she called out, weaving between tables with the kind of casual grace that made other diners turn to look. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What a coincidence running into you here. The performance was flawless, except for one crucial detail. Amanda's eyes found mine before they found David's, and in that split second of contact, I saw something that confirmed every suspicion I'd been harboring. Recognition. Not surprise at an unexpected encounter, but the careful acknowledgement of someone who knew exactly where to find us. David's reaction was equally telling. The flush that crept up his neck, the way his hand involuntarily tightened around his wine glass, the smile that was just slightly too bright to be natural. Amanda, what a surprise. Jessica, you remember Amanda from the company party. I did indeed remember Amanda from the company party 3 months ago. She'd been charming and deferential, asking thoughtful questions about my work at TechFlow, while somehow managing to position herself in every photo with David. I'd noticed how she laughed at his jokes, how she found excuses to touch his arm, while making conversation, how she seemed to have memorized details about our life that went far beyond normal workplace small talk. Of course, I said, standing to offer a handshake that she turned into an air kiss. "How lovely to see you again." "I'm here with some friends," Amanda said, gesturing vaguely toward a table across the restaurant. "Northwestern Alumni Group, you know how it is. When I saw you two, I just had to come say hello." I followed her gesture and noticed the table she'd indicated was occupied by two women deep in conversation, neither of whom had looked up at Amanda's approach to our table. Either her friends were remarkably uninterested in her social interactions, or Amanda's explanation was as carefully constructed as David's earlier phone call story. "Would you like to join us for a drink?" David asked, and the invitation came. So quickly, so naturally, that I knew this moment had been planned. Not the coincidence Amanda was pretending it was, but a carefully orchestrated encounter designed to look accidental. "Oh, I couldn't intrude on your anniversary dinner," Amanda protested with exactly the right amount of reluctance. "This is such a special occasion." The dance continued for several more minutes, David insisting it would be no trouble, Amanda demurring while somehow managing to make it clear she'd love to accept, me sitting in stunned silence as I watched. My husband orchestrate what was clearly a predetermined performance. Finally, inevitably, Amanda allowed herself to be convinced to join us for one drink before returning to her friends. The maitre d' appeared with a third chair as if he'd been expecting this development. And suddenly, our intimate anniversary. Dinner had become a threesome that felt anything but accidental. Amanda slipped into the seat between David and me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something light and expensive that definitely wasn't drugstore. "I hope you don't mind," she said, directing the comment to me while her eyes remained fixed on David. "I know how important tonight is for you both." The comment landed with surgical precision. Amanda knew exactly how important tonight was, which meant David had discussed our anniversary with her in enough detail for her to understand its significance. The same anniversary dinner he'd supposedly been planning as a surprise for weeks had been shared with his secretary in advance. As our server approached with menus and wine recommendations, I found myself studying Amanda with the same analytical intensity I brought to market research. Everything about her was carefully curated, from the designer dress that probably represented a month's salary to the delicate gold jewelry that caught the light when she gestured. Her laugh was musical without being grating, her conversation intelligent without being threatening, her attention to David just obvious enough to be noticed, but subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability. She was, I realized, exactly what David would choose if he were selecting a replacement for me. Young enough to make him feel vital, ambitious enough to understand his professional world, beautiful enough to boost his ego, and sophisticated enough to fit into the life we'd built together. The perfect upgrade for a man approaching 40, who worried he'd settled too early. "Jessica's been telling me about the new campaign you're developing at TechFlow," David said, and I realized I'd been quiet long enough for my silence to become noticeable. The one targeting healthcare providers. I hadn't been telling David anything about the healthcare campaign. In fact, I'd been deliberately keeping work discussions minimal lately, partly because of his obvious distraction, and partly because something about his sudden interest in my projects felt invasive rather than supportive. "It's still in development," I said carefully, wondering how David knew enough about the campaign to mention it to Amanda. Had he been going through my laptop? Listening to my phone calls with clients? The thought made my skin crawl. "David mentioned you're focusing on decision-making psychology," Amanda chimed in, her knowledge of my project details confirming my suspicions. "That's fascinating. We use similar principles in pharmaceutical sales, understanding what motivates doctors to try new treatments." The conversation that followed was surreal in its normalcy. Amanda demonstrated detailed knowledge of both my work and David's, weaving connections between our industries with the kind of insight that only came from extensive discussion. She asked intelligent questions about market segmentation and consumer behavior, nodding thoughtfully at my responses while somehow managing to make every exchange feel like it included David as an essential third party. Meanwhile, David played the perfect host, ensuring Amanda's wine glass stayed full, laughing at her observations about the restaurant's molecular gastronomy presentation, steering the conversation to topics that allowed her to shine. I watched him perform the same courtship rituals I remembered from our early dating days. The focused attention and careful charm that had made me feel like the most interesting woman in the room. Now, I was watching him deploy those same techniques on someone else while I sat 3 feet away. The first course arrived with the kind of theatrical presentation Alinea was famous for. Dry ice and carefully arranged microgreens, creating an Instagram-worthy moment that Amanda immediately captured with her phone. "This is incredible," she breathed, and David leaned closer to point out details of the chef's technique, their heads nearly touching as they examined the artistry on their plates. I sat there mechanically eating what was probably a masterpiece of culinary innovation, tasting nothing, my mind racing through calculations and probabilities like a spreadsheet sorting data. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed to be certain before I acted. 8 years of marriage deserved more than speculation and suspicion. "Excuse me," I said, standing abruptly. "I need to use the restroom." Neither David nor Amanda seemed particularly concerned by my departure, already deep in conversation about something related to MedCore's upcoming product launch. As I walked toward the back of the restaurant, I pulled out my phone and did what any self-respecting marketing director would do when faced with incomplete information. I started gathering data. Amanda's social media profiles were public, a mistake that revealed more than she probably intended. Her Instagram showed a careful curation of professional success and social activities, but it was the timing of her posts that caught my attention. Photos from client dinners that coincided with David's late nights at work. Check-ins at restaurants he'd claimed to visit alone for business development. A picture from last weekend at Navy Pier, captioned with a cryptic, "Sometimes the best." "Plans are the spontaneous ones," posted during the hours David had told me he was playing golf with his college roommate. Her LinkedIn profile was even more revealing. Amanda had been promoted twice in the 6 months since joining MedCore, rapid advancement that seemed remarkable for someone with minimal experience. Her recommendations included glowing praise from David, describing her as intuitive, dedicated, and possessing exceptional insight into client psychology. Professional language that somehow managed to sound intimate. But it was her Facebook profile that provided the smoking gun I needed. Hidden among carefully cropped photos and strategic privacy settings, I found what I was looking for. Check-ins and tagged locations that matched David's supposed business trips. Comments from friends asking about her mystery man that she deflected, with laughing emojis and promises to reveal all soon. And, most damning of all, a photo from 2 weeks ago showing a partial view of what was unmistakably our living room, captioned, "Sunday morning coffee tastes better in good company." David had brought Amanda to our home, into the space we'd built together, the kitchen where he cooked our anniversary breakfast every year, the living room where we'd planned our future and celebrated our successes. The violation felt more intimate than any physical betrayal could have been. I scrolled through more posts, my marketing mind automatically cataloging patterns and connections. Amanda's social media told the story of a relationship that had been developing for months, carefully hidden, but not quite carefully enough. Photos of dinners at restaurants David had claimed to visit for client meetings. Weekend activities that coincided with his mysterious golf games and networking events. A gradually increasing comfort level that suggested this wasn't a recent development. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "How's the anniversary dinner? Send pictures." The reminder of what tonight was supposed to represent made my chest tighten with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. I typed back, "Interesting evening. We'll call you tomorrow." When I returned to the table, David and Amanda were sharing the second course, their forks dancing around the same plate in a gesture that was either meaningless or incredibly intimate depending on your perspective. Given everything I'd just discovered, I was leaning heavily toward the latter interpretation. "Everything okay?" David asked as I settled back into my chair, his concern seeming genuine until I noticed how quickly his attention returned to Amanda's commentary on the restaurant's wine selection. "Perfect," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Just needed a moment to process how wonderful this evening has been. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's betrayal was unfolding at the same restaurant where he'd proposed 8 years ago. The same table where he'd gotten down on one knee and promised to love me faithfully for the rest of our lives. The same maitre d' who'd coordinated the surprise champagne toast that made me cry with joy was now facilitating what appeared to be David's audition of my replacement. But if David thought he could manipulate me the way he manipulated his pharmaceutical clients, he had seriously underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. I hadn't built my career by accepting surface-level explanations or allowing myself to be distracted by charming presentations. I'd succeeded by digging deeper, asking harder questions, and never settling for anything less than the complete truth. As Amanda laughed at another of David's stories, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture that was becoming increasingly familiar, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of all our lives. It was time to drop the bombshell that would expose exactly what kind of performance I'd been watching all evening. The third course arrived with another flourish of culinary theater, but I barely registered the artfully arranged elements on my plate. My mind was operating in full analytical mode, the same focused intensity I brought to dissecting market research data or identifying gaps in competitor strategies. David and Amanda continued their carefully choreographed dance of plausible deniability, but now I could see the performance for what it truly was. Every gesture between them carried meaning. The way Amanda tilted her head when David spoke, mirroring the body language I'd unconsciously adopted during our early courtship. How David's laugh became more animated when directed toward her. The same infectious enthusiasm that had first attracted me to him at that networking event 8 years ago. They had developed their own private language of glances and subtle touches, a communication system that excluded me, even as I sat directly beside them. Amanda excused herself to check on her supposed friends, and I watched her walk across the restaurant with the confidence of someone who knew she was being observed. Her table of Northwestern alumni showed no recognition of her approach, continuing their conversation without acknowledging her presence. She hovered near their table for exactly 30 seconds, long enough to maintain the illusion, before returning to us with apologies about needing to leave soon. "They're heading to that new rooftop bar in River North," she explained, settling back into her chair with a theatrical sigh. "Early night for me, unfortunately." David's disappointment seemed genuine, which told me everything I needed to know about his investment in Amanda's presence at our anniversary dinner. That's too bad. We were just getting to the good part of the tasting menu. The ease with which he expressed regret about another woman's departure at our anniversary dinner, while I sat 3 feet away, crystallized something cold and sharp in my chest. This wasn't just infidelity. This was deliberate cruelty. A calculated demonstration of how completely David had checked out of our marriage. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying the same measured tone I used during client presentations, "I think this is perfect timing. I have something I'd like to share with both of you." Amanda's eyebrows lifted with polite interest, but I caught the flicker of uncertainty that crossed her features. David leaned forward expectantly, probably assuming I was about to propose some toast or anniversary reflection that would make Amanda's presence feel more natural. Instead, I opened my phone and placed it on the table, the screen displaying Amanda's Instagram profile with its carefully curated timeline of deception. "I've been doing some research," I began, using the same conversational tone I employed when presenting market analysis to skeptical clients. "You know how it is in marketing, Amanda. We're always looking for patterns, trying to understand consumer behavior and motivations." Amanda's face had gone very still, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. David glanced at my phone screen, and I watched comprehension dawn in his expression like a slow-motion car crash. For instance, I continued, scrolling to a specific post, this photo from last weekend. Navy Pier posted at 2:30 on Saturday afternoon. Interesting timing, since that's exactly when David told me he was playing golf with his college roommate Mark. I tapped the screen to enlarge the image, which showed Amanda's reflection in the window of a lakefront restaurant, unmistakably accompanied by a male figure whose profile looked remarkably like my husband. The metadata is fascinating too, I added, noting how both David and Amanda had become completely motionless. Location services are so precise these days. Every post, every check-in, creating a digital trail that's remarkably easy to follow once you know what you're looking for. David found his voice first, though it came out rougher than his usual smooth sales pitch. Jessica, I think you're misunderstanding. Am I? I interrupted, swiping to another post. Let's see. 2 weeks ago, this lovely shot of Sunday morning coffee. The caption says, Sunday morning coffee tastes better in good company. And while the photo is cropped carefully, that's definitely our kitchen island in the background. The same granite countertop we picked out together 3 years ago when we renovated. Amanda's carefully composed facade was beginning to crack. I can explain that. I'm sure you can, I said pleasantly. I'm sure you have explanations for all of this. The question is whether those explanations will be as creative as this entire evening has been. I gestured around the table, including both of them in my observation. This performance, for instance, the coincidental encounter, the reluctant acceptance of our invitation, the just friends from work dynamic you've both been so committed to maintaining. It's really quite impressive from a strategic standpoint. David's face had flushed red, but whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. You're making a scene, Jessica. No, I corrected, my voice remaining perfectly level. I'm conducting a presentation. The kind of detailed analysis I do every day at work, except tonight, the subject matter happens to be my marriage. I swiped to the next piece of evidence, a LinkedIn screenshot showing Amanda's rapid promotion timeline. 6 months at MedCore Pharmaceuticals, 2 promotions, glowing recommendations from senior management. Particularly this one from David, describing your exceptional insight into client psychology and dedication that goes far beyond normal business. Hours. Amanda's professional mask had completely slipped now, revealing something raw and defensive underneath. David is an excellent mentor. I'm sure he is, I agreed. The question is, what exactly he's been mentoring you in? Because according to your social media activity, your education has extended far beyond pharmaceutical sales techniques. I had prepared for this moment the way I prepared for any crucial client presentation, anticipating objections and counter-arguments, gathering evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. The marketing director in me understood that successful persuasion required overwhelming documentation, not emotional appeals. David, I said, turning to address my husband directly, would you like to explain to Amanda and me exactly how many of your supposed client dinners over the past 6 months have actually involved clients? The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Around us, other diners continued their own conversations, unaware that they were witnessing the systematic deconstruction of an 8-year marriage. The server approached with the 4th course, took one look at our table's atmosphere, and retreated without a word. Or perhaps, I continued when neither of them responded, you'd prefer to explain why your credit card statements show charges for 2 people at restaurants you claim to visit alone for business development purposes. David's composure finally cracked. You've been going through my credit card statements? There are credit card statements, I corrected. Joint accounts, remember? The ones we established when we got married and promised to build a life together based on honesty and mutual respect. The hypocrisy of his outrage would have been laughable if it weren't so revealing. David was genuinely shocked that I had discovered his deception, not because he felt guilty about the betrayal, but because he hadn't anticipated my investigative capabilities. "I think I should go," Amanda said quietly, beginning to gather her purse. "Actually," I said, my tone still conversational but carrying an edge that made her freeze, "I think you should stay. We're just getting to the interesting part." I pulled up a new screen on my phone, this one showing a document I'd prepared during my supposed restroom break. "You see, Amanda, I've been thinking about your career trajectory at MedCore. 2 promotions in 6 months is remarkable for someone with your limited experience. I'm curious about the selection criteria." Amanda's eyes darted to David, looking for guidance or rescue, but he seemed as trapped as she was. "I'm particularly interested in the timing," I continued. "Your first promotion came exactly 2 weeks after David's credit card statements show the first dinner for 2 at Le Bernardin. Your second promotion coincided with what appears to have been a weekend trip to Milwaukee that David described to me as a solo sales conference. I had spent the past 30 minutes in the restroom conducting the kind of rapid-fire digital investigation that my marketing background had taught me to execute efficiently. Cross-referencing social media posts with David's explained absences, comparing Amanda's professional advancement with the timeline of their relationship, building a case that would be impossible to deny. "The thing about data," I said, addressing both of them now, "is that it tells stories. And the story your data tells is quite different from the narrative you've been presenting." David finally found his voice, though it lacked its usual confidence. "Jessica, you're jumping to conclusions. Amanda and I work closely together, yes, but nothing inappropriate has happened?" I finished for him. "Is that really the explanation you want to go with?" I swiped to another screen, showing a screenshot of text messages I'd recovered from our shared cloud storage. David's automatic backup settings had been uploading his messages without his knowledge, a technological oversight that proved catastrophic for his deception. "Because these messages suggest otherwise," I said, reading directly from the screen. "Tuesday, October 15th. Can't wait to hold you again. These client dinners aren't enough anymore. Wednesday, October 23rd. Jessica suspects nothing. We just need to be more careful about the timing." Amanda's face had gone completely white. David looked like he was going to be sick. "Friday, November 1st, I continued reading. David writes, "I've made a reservation at a Linea for our anniversary. It'll be the perfect opportunity for you to see how things really are between Jessica and me." And Amanda responds, "Are you sure it's wise to include me?" To which David replies, "Trust me, after tonight she'll understand that our marriage is already over." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Other diners at nearby tables had begun to notice our conversation, though they were trying to be discreet about their attention. The maître d' was hovering at the edge of the dining room, clearly debating whether to intervene. "So you see," I said, my voice still calm despite the chaos erupting inside my chest, "this evening was never about celebrating our anniversary. It was about demonstrating to your girlfriend how little our marriage means to you, using me as an unwitting prop in your relationship drama." David's jaw worked silently for several seconds before he managed to speak. "Jessica, I never meant for it to happen this way." "How did you mean for it to happen?" I interrupted. "Were you planning to have an honest conversation about wanting out of our marriage? Or were you just going to continue sneaking around until I eventually figured it out or stopped caring?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, as if he'd never actually considered how his deception would ultimately resolve. That realization told me everything I needed to know about David's long-term planning abilities and his respect for me as a partner. "I think," I said, placing my phone face down on the table, "we need to discuss what happens next." Amanda started to stand again. "I really should leave you two to sit down," I said, my voice carrying enough authority to make her comply immediately. "You're part of this conversation now, Amanda. You've been part of it for months, apparently." I signaled to our server, who approached with visible reluctance. Could you please ask the maitre d' to join us and perhaps bring us a bottle of your best champagne? We have something to celebrate after all. David looked confused. Jessica, what are you doing? I'm adapting to new information, I replied. The same way I do at work when market conditions change unexpectedly. You reassess your strategy and pivot accordingly. The maitre d' arrived with practiced professional composure, though I could see his concern about the tension at our table. Is everything satisfactory this evening? Actually, I said, standing and extending my hand to him, I'd like to make an announcement. Could you gather the staff for a moment? David grabbed my wrist. Jessica, don't do this. Not here. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back at his face. Let go of me, David. He released me immediately, perhaps recognizing something in my tone that suggested he was already in enough trouble without adding physical restraint to his list of offenses. The maitre d' looked between us uncertainly. Perhaps we could discuss this privately. No need, I said brightly. This is actually perfect. You see, 8 years ago, my husband proposed to me at this very restaurant. At this exact table, in fact. Tonight was supposed to be our anniversary celebration, but it turns out we're actually here for a different kind of milestone. Several servers had gathered nearby, drawn by the maitre d's concerned expression and the obvious tension at our table. Other diners were no longer pretending not to watch our conversation. Tonight, I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the dining room, I discovered that my husband has been having an affair with his secretary for the past 6 months. They planned this evening as a way to demonstrate how little our marriage means to him, using our anniversary dinner as a stage for their relationship audition. The collective intake of breath from the surrounding tables was audible. David's face had gone gray, while Amanda looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor. So I'd like to propose a toast, I continued, accepting the champagne. Flute the thoroughly bewildered server had just poured. To David and Amanda, who have taught me that sometimes the most valuable data comes from the sources you least expect to provide it. I raised my glass toward the 2 people who had spent months systematically destroying my marriage while performing concern for my happiness. And to myself, I added, for remembering that I'm a successful, intelligent woman who deserves better than being treated like a fool by people who clearly underestimated my investigative capabilities. The dining room had gone completely quiet. Every conversation suspended as dozens of strangers witnessed the public implosion of what they'd probably assumed was a normal anniversary celebration. Jessica, David said urgently, can we please discuss this privately? We had 8 years to discuss things privately, I replied. You chose to include Amanda in our marriage without consulting me. I'm simply returning the favor by including everyone here in our divorce. I drained my champagne in one long swallow, placed the empty flute on the table, and turned to address Amanda directly. I hope you understand what you're getting into, I said conversationally. David is charming and successful and excellent at making women feel special. He's also a liar who will betray anyone when it serves his interests. But perhaps you already know that and simply don't care. Amanda's voice came out as barely a whisper. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Of course you didn't, I agreed. You just meant to steal someone else's husband and destroy their marriage for your own advancement. Completely different thing. I gathered my purse and coat, moving with the same efficient precision I used during client presentations when I needed to maintain authority despite emotional turbulence. David, I said, I'll be staying at Maria's tonight. I suggest you use the time to decide whether you want to discuss our divorce settlement like civilized adults or whether you'd prefer to let my attorney handle all future communications. I turned to leave, then paused and addressed the maitre. To one final time. Thank you for 8 years of wonderful anniversary dinners, I said. I'm sorry this one ended so differently than the others. As I walked toward the exit, leaving David and Amanda sitting in stunned silence at our ruined anniversary table, I felt something unexpected rising in my chest. not heartbreak or devastation, though those would come later. Instead, I felt the same fierce satisfaction I experienced when a particularly challenging marketing campaign finally clicked into place. I had identified the problem, gathered comprehensive data, and executed a strategic response that left no room for denial or manipulation. David and Amanda had underestimated me completely, assuming that 8 years of marriage had made me complacent and trusting enough to accept their carefully constructed lies. They were about to discover exactly how wrong they had been. The November wind cut through my coat as I stood on the sidewalk outside Alinea, my breath forming small clouds in the eye. Chicago night air. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a strange mixture of clarity and disorientation. 8 years of marriage had just ended over molecular gastronomy and champagne, witnessed by dozens of strangers who would probably be telling this story at dinner parties for months to come. My phone buzzed with a call from Maria, but I wasn't ready to explain what had just happened. Instead, I hailed a cab and gave the driver my sister's address in Naperville, settling into the back seat as downtown Chicago's lights blurred past. The windows. The city looked different somehow, as if the revelation of David's betrayal had shifted the entire landscape of my life. During the 40-minute drive to Maria's house, I found myself mentally cataloging everything I needed to do. Cancel joint credit cards, change passwords on shared accounts, contact our mortgage lender, begin the process of legally separating our intertwined financial lives. The marketing director in me was already creating mental spreadsheets and timelines, treating the dissolution of my marriage like any other complex project that required systematic execution. But underneath the professional competence, something rawer was beginning to surface. The humiliation of discovering that my husband had been planning tonight's betrayal for weeks, possibly months. The realization that Amanda hadn't stumbled into our marriage accidentally, but had been actively participating in its destruction. The gut-wrenching knowledge that David had been living a double life with such skill that I'd never suspected. The depth of his deception. Maria's porch light was on when the cab pulled into her driveway, and I could see her silhouette in the front window, probably waiting up to hear about my romantic anniversary dinner. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to deliver news that would shatter her faith in David, whom she'd always considered the perfect brother-in-law. She opened the front door before I could knock, her expression shifting from excited anticipation to concern as she took in my appearance. "Jess? What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," I said, accepting her hug and the warmth of her living room. "Is Carlos asleep?" "He's at his brother's house, with the kids for the weekend," Maria replied, studying my face with the worried intensity that only sisters could manage. "Talk to me. What's going on?" I settled onto her familiar couch, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a house where 2 teenage daughters lived and thrived, soccer trophies and school photos, Maria's teaching certificates on the wall, Carlos's guitar in the corner where he practiced after long days at the accounting firm, evidence of a real marriage built on genuine partnership and shared dreams. "David's been having an affair," I said simply, "with his secretary, for at least 6 months, possibly longer." Maria's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to anger to protective fury. "That bastard! How did you find out?" I told her everything. The phone call I'd overheard, Amanda's planned appearance at our anniversary dinner, the social media investigation that had revealed months of careful deception. Maria listened without interruption, her teacher's instincts allowing me to process the information at my own pace, while she absorbed the details. "He brought her to your anniversary dinner?" Maria's voice carried the kind of outrage that made her such an effective advocate for her students. "What kind of sociopath does that?" "The kind who wanted to demonstrate how little our marriage meant to him," I replied. "According to their text messages, tonight was supposed to show Amanda that David and I were essentially already divorced. She was auditioning for the role of his next wife." Maria stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. I never liked him. I mean, I tried to like him for your sake, but there was always something performative about David, like he was playing the part of the perfect husband instead of actually being one. The observation hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. Looking back, I could see the signs I'd ignored or rationalized away. David's tendency to discuss our relationship in terms of achievements and milestones rather than emotions. The way he seemed more invested in appearing successful than in actually building something meaningful together. His habit of treating our shared decisions like sales presentations where he needed to convince me to see things his way. What are you going to do? Maria asked, settling back onto the couch beside me. Divorce him, I said without hesitation. The question is how to do it strategically. David's been planning this for months, which means he's probably already taken steps to protect his assets or minimize his exposure. Maria nodded thoughtfully. You need a lawyer, a good one. I need more than that, I said, my marketing mind already shifting into strategic mode. I need to understand the full scope of what I'm dealing with. David's betrayal tonight was just the surface. There are deeper patterns here that I need to uncover before I make any legal moves. I opened my laptop and began pulling up financial statements, social media profiles, and professional records. The same investigative techniques I'd used to expose tonight's deception could be applied more systematically to understand exactly what David had been planning and how long he'd been planning it. Can I help? Maria asked, settling beside me, with 2 cups of coffee despite the late hour. Actually, yes, I said, grateful for her steady presence. You're good with people, better than I am at reading emotional subtext. I need you to help me understand the psychology behind what David and Amanda have been doing. Over the next several hours, we built a comprehensive timeline of David's deception. Maria proved invaluable at interpreting the emotional dynamics I'd missed, pointing out patterns in David's behavior that made more sense when viewed as part of a deliberate strategy rather than natural relationship evolution. Look at this, she said, pointing to a series of social media posts from Amanda's profile. She's not just documenting her relationship with David, she's studying you. Look how many of her posts reference things you've mentioned in conversations, or places you've taken David. I followed her reasoning and felt a chill of recognition. Amanda's Instagram showed a deliberate pattern of adopting my interests and preferences, from the coffee shops I frequented to the art galleries David and I visited together. She hadn't just been having an affair with my husband, she'd been systematically learning how to replace me. It's like she's been conducting market research, I said, the professional terminology helping me maintain analytical distance from the personal violation. Learning my demographic profile so she could position herself as an improved version. Exactly, Maria agreed. And David's been facilitating it. Look at how often he mentions your work projects or your weekend plans in their text exchanges. He's been providing her with intelligence about your life. The betrayal ran deeper than infidelity. David had been systematically sharing intimate details of our marriage with another woman, giving her the information she needed to understand and eventually replace me. Every conversation we'd had about my work, my dreams, my insecurities had potentially been shared with Amanda as part of her research into becoming the next Mrs. Chen. There's something else, Maria said, her voice careful. I think Amanda might not be the first. I looked up from the laptop screen. What do you mean? Some of these patterns go back further than 6 months, she explained. Remember when David went through that phase of suddenly being interested in wine, and then the period where he was obsessed with contemporary art? Each time, he seemed to be adopting interests that didn't quite fit his personality. The suggestion made my stomach drop. Had David been practicing this pattern with other women before Amanda? Had our entire marriage been punctuated by affairs I'd been too trusting, or too busy to notice? We need more data, I said, applying the same systematic approach that had made me successful in marketing. If David's been doing this before, there will be evidence. Patterns in his behavior, financial records, social media connections. Maria and I spent the rest of the night conducting what amounted to a forensic analysis of my marriage. We cross-referenced David's credit card statements with his explained absences, mapped his social media connections for unusual patterns, and analyzed his phone records for recurring numbers that didn't correspond to known business contacts. By dawn, we had constructed a picture that was both comprehensive and devastating. David's affair with Amanda wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It appeared to be the latest iteration of a pattern that stretched back almost to the beginning of our marriage. The evidence suggested at least 3 previous relationships that had followed similar trajectories: gradual emotional involvement, shared interests that temporarily shifted David's personality, and then mysterious endings that coincided with his renewed attention to our marriage. "He's been doing this our entire relationship," I said, staring at the timeline we'd constructed. "Amanda isn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. She's part of a system." Maria reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm so sorry, Jess. This is so much worse than I thought." The systematic nature of David's betrayal was almost more devastating than the betrayal itself. It meant our marriage had never been what I thought it was. While I'd been building what I believed was a partnership based on love and mutual respect, David had been treating our relationship like a home base between more exciting adventures with other women. "The question now," I said, closing the laptop, as morning light began filtering through Maria's living room windows, "is what I'm going to do with this information." My phone had been buzzing periodically throughout the night with calls and texts from David, but I'd ignored them all. According to the message previews, his communications had evolved from angry demands for explanation to increasingly desperate pleas for conversation. The progression suggested he was beginning to understand the scope of what I'd discovered and the implications for his carefully constructed double life. "You could just divorce him quietly," Maria suggested. "Take what you can get and start over." "I could," I agreed. "But that wouldn't address the broader pattern. David's going to do this to Amanda eventually, and then to whoever comes after her. And there are probably other women out there who don't even know they were part of his rotation." The marketing strategist in me was already identifying the key stakeholders who needed to be informed about David's pattern of behavior. Amanda certainly, though whether she would believe the evidence or dismiss it as the vindictive lies of a discarded wife remained to be seen. David's employer, where his relationship with Amanda had clearly crossed professional boundaries and potentially violated company policies. The other women whose lives had been disrupted by David's systematic infidelity, assuming I could identify and contact them. "You're thinking about something," Maria observed. "I can see those wheels turning." "I'm thinking about consequences," I replied. "David's actions haven't just affected me. He's created a pattern of harm that extends to multiple women and potentially to his professional environment. The question is whether I have an obligation to address those broader implications." Maria considered this. "What would addressing them look like?" "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "But I think it starts with making sure Amanda understands what she's actually getting involved with. She's young and ambitious, and she might genuinely believe David's narrative about our marriage being over. She deserves to know the full context of what she's participating in." My phone rang again. David's name appearing on the screen for what felt like the 100th time since I'd left the restaurant. This time, I answered. "Jessica, thank God," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion or stress. "We need to talk. I know how this looks, but I can explain everything." "No," I said calmly. "You can't explain everything, because explaining would require admitting to patterns of behavior that go back years, and we both know you're not ready to have that conversation." There was silence on the other end of the line. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the systematic way you've been conducting affairs throughout our marriage while maintaining the facade of being a devoted husband. I'm talking about the way you've used me as emotional and financial stability while pursuing excitement elsewhere. Jessica, that's not... David, I interrupted. I have evidence. Comprehensive, documented evidence going back to the second year of our marriage. So before you waste both our time with denials and gaslighting, you should know that I've spent the night conducting the kind of thorough analysis I do at work when I need to understand complex market behaviors. Another silence. Longer this time. What do you want? He finally asked, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I want you to understand that your choices have consequences beyond your immediate gratification, I said. And I want you to know that those consequences are about to become very real and very public. What does that mean? It means I'm going to make sure Amanda understands the full scope of what she's gotten involved with. It means I'm going to ensure your employer is aware of the ethical violations you've been committing. And it means I'm going to contact the other women whose lives you've disrupted with your pattern of deception. You can't do that, David said, panic creeping into his voice. You'll ruin my career, my reputation. You ruined your career and reputation, I corrected. I'm simply going to make sure the relevant parties have access to accurate information about your character and behavior patterns. Jessica, please, we can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can rebuild. We can't rebuild something that was never real in the first place, I said. Our marriage was a performance you maintained while living your actual life with other people. The only thing we can do now is end it with as much dignity as possible. I hung up before he could respond, feeling a strange sense of completion. The conversation had confirmed what I'd suspected. David's concern wasn't about losing me or about the pain he'd caused. His panic was entirely focused on the professional and social consequences of his actions becoming public knowledge. How did that feel? Maria asked. Clarifying, I replied. David's not sorry about what he did. He's sorry he got caught, and he's terrified about what happens next. And what does happen next? I looked at my sister, surrounded by evidence of her genuine, stable marriage, and felt a surge of determination that surprised me with its intensity. Next, I make sure David learns that actions have consequences, and I make sure Amanda and any other women involved understand exactly who they're dealing with. The sun was fully up now, painting Maria's living room in golden light that made everything feel possible despite the devastation of the previous night. I had work to do, calls to make, strategies to implement. David had spent months planning my humiliation. Now it was my turn to plan his reckoning. Monday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency of November in Chicago, and I woke up in Maria's guest bedroom with the strange sensation of having crossed into a completely different life overnight. The woman who had dressed for an anniversary, dinner 2 days ago, no longer existed. In her place was someone harder, clearer, and infinitely more dangerous to the people who had underestimated her. I had called in sick to TechFlow Solutions, something I hadn't done in 3 years, but the systematic dismantling of David's carefully constructed lies required my full attention. Maria had already left for school, leaving me with coffee and a note of encouragement that included her teacher's precise handwriting, reminding me that I was stronger than I knew. My first call was to Rachel Thompson, my friend from Northwestern, who had built a successful family law practice specializing in high-asset divorces. Rachel had always been the most ruthlessly practical person in our social circle, the one who could dissect complex problems with surgical precision while maintaining perfect composure. Jessica, Rachel answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency that made her such a formidable attorney. I heard through the grapevine that you might need my services. Something about a spectacular public confrontation at Alinea? News traveled fast in Chicago's professional circles, apparently. Word gets around quickly. Honey, by now half of Lincoln Park knows that David Chen's wife caught him and his secretary red-handed at their anniversary dinner. The details get more dramatic with each telling, but the basic facts seem consistent. I felt a flush of embarrassment at being the subject of gossip, quickly followed by satisfaction that David's reputation was already suffering consequences. How much do people know? Enough to make David's life uncomfortable for the foreseeable future, Rachel replied. But let's focus on protecting your interests. Can you come in this morning? I want to hear everything from the beginning, and we need to move quickly on asset protection. 2 hours later, I sat in Rachel's downtown office overlooking the Chicago River, laying out the evidence I'd compiled over the weekend. Rachel listened with the focused intensity of someone mentally calculating billable hours and strategic advantages, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification about specific details. This pattern of behavior changes everything, she said when I finished. We're not dealing with a simple infidelity case. This is systematic deception spanning years, potentially involving workplace harassment, misuse of joint assets, and fraud if he's been hiding income or expenses related to these relationships. What does that mean practically? It means we can pursue a fault-based divorce that will significantly impact the asset division, Rachel explained. Illinois allows for consideration of misconduct in property settlements, especially when one spouse has been deliberately depleting marital assets for extramarital relationships. She pulled up a legal database on her computer, fingers flying across the keyboard as she researched precedents and strategies. The systematic nature of David's behavior also opens up possibilities for claims of intentional infliction of emotional distress. Courts don't look kindly on calculated long-term deception that involves elaborate planning and multiple victims. How long will this take? Depends on how cooperative David wants to be, Rachel said. If he's smart, he'll recognize that fighting us in court would require depositions and discovery that would expose even more of his behavior to public scrutiny. His best option is to negotiate a settlement that acknowledges his misconduct and compensates you accordingly. I nodded, feeling the familiar satisfaction of having a clear strategy and competent execution. What about Amanda and the other women? Rachel's expression sharpened. What about them? Amanda deserves to know what she's gotten involved with, and the other women David manipulated might have legal claims of their own, especially if any of them were his subordinates or clients. Be very careful here, Rachel warned. Contacting Amanda could be seen as harassment or intimidation. As for the other women, without their consent, reaching out could create liability for you. But they have a right to know? They have a right to know, yes. But the approach matters enormously. Let me think about the best way to handle this that protects you legally while still ensuring they get the information they need. Rachel's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and she glanced at the screen before looking up at me with raised eyebrows. Speak of the devil. David's attorney is calling. Already? David's panicked, she observed, which means he understands the scope of his exposure. Do you want me to take this call? I nodded, and Rachel activated the speakerphone. The voice that emerged belonged to James Morrison, a family law attorney whose reputation for aggressive tactics was well known in Chicago legal circles. Rachel, I understand you're representing Jessica Chen in a potential divorce matter. That's correct, James. Though given the circumstances, I'd say it's moved well beyond potential. My client is hoping we can resolve this matter amicably, without unnecessary publicity or complications. Rachel's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Your client should have considered unnecessary complications before he spent years conducting systematic affairs while using marital assets to fund his extracurricular activities. There was a pause. I think there may be some misunderstanding about the scope and nature of... James, Rachel interrupted, I have documentation going back 5 years. Bank records, credit card statements, social media evidence, text messages, and witness testimony. If David wants to characterize this as a misunderstanding, he's welcome to try explaining it to a judge. What are your client's terms? Rachel looked at me, and I nodded for her to proceed. Full disclosure of all assets, including any accounts or properties David may have acquired independently. Acknowledgement of fault in the divorce proceedings. 70-30 split of marital assets in Jessica's favor, plus compensation for emotional distress and the cost of David's deception. That's completely unreasonable. What's unreasonable, Rachel said smoothly, is expecting Jessica to accept a standard 50-50 split when her husband has been systematically violating their marriage contract for years. But if David prefers to have these details examined in open court, with depositions from Amanda Foster and potentially other women, we're happy to proceed with litigation. Another pause, longer this time. I'll need to discuss this with my client. You have 48 hours, Rachel said. After that, we file for divorce and request expedited discovery. I assume David would prefer to avoid having his employer subpoenaed for records of his relationship with Ms. Foster. After ending the call, Rachel turned to me with satisfaction. David's already running scared. Morrison wouldn't have called this quickly unless his client was in full panic mode. Is the settlement realistic? More than realistic. Given the evidence you've compiled, I think we can probably push for even better terms. David's misconduct is so well documented that any reasonable judge would award you significantly more than half the marital assets. The satisfaction of having legal leverage was gratifying, but it didn't address the broader issue of ensuring Amanda and the other women understood what they were dealing with. As Rachel and I discussed strategy and timelines, I found myself thinking about the young woman who had sat at our anniversary dinner, genuinely believing she was part of David's bright future rather than just the latest iteration of his established pattern. After leaving Rachel's office, I drove back to Lincoln Park and parked outside the Starbucks, where I'd often seen Amanda during her lunch breaks from MedCore. The pharmaceutical company's Schaumburg office was a 40-minute commute from downtown, but Amanda frequently came into the city for client meetings and professional development sessions. I didn't have to wait long. Amanda emerged from the L station at 12:30, checking her phone as she walked toward the coffee shop with the same confident stride I'd witnessed at the restaurant. In daylight, without the theatrical lighting of Alinea, she looked younger and more vulnerable, though still possessed of the polished professionalism that had clearly impressed David. I intercepted her before she reached the entrance. Amanda, could I speak with you for a few minutes? Her face went through a series of expressions, from recognition to wariness to something that might have been guilt. Jessica, I don't think we should— Please, I said. 5 minutes. There are things you need to know about David that go far beyond what happened between us. Amanda glanced around nervously, as if checking for witnesses or escape routes. Finally, she nodded toward a small park across the street. Not here. Too many people from work come to this Starbucks. We walked to the park in silence, settling on a bench beneath bare November trees that provided the illusion of privacy, despite the afternoon foot traffic. Amanda kept her distance, perched on the edge of the bench as if ready to flee at any moment. I know you probably think I'm here to threaten you or cause problems for your career, I began. That's not why I came. Then why? Amanda's voice was defensive but curious. Because you're not the first, and you won't be the last. I pulled out my laptop and opened the timeline Maria and I had constructed. David has been conducting affairs throughout our entire marriage. You're the latest in a pattern that goes back years. Amanda's eyes flicked to the screen, and I watched her professional composure falter as she took in the documented evidence of David's systematic infidelity. Financial records showing dinners for two during periods when he'd claimed to be traveling, alone for business. Social media posts from other women that followed the same trajectory as her own relationship with David. A pattern of professional mentorship that had blurred into personal involvement, then into secretive affairs. "This isn't possible," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I thought the same thing," I replied. "But the data doesn't lie. David has been using his position and charm to initiate relationships with younger women, typically those who work for his company or in related industries. He provides professional guidance and advancement opportunities in exchange for personal involvement, then discards them when he gets bored or when they start expecting more commitment." I pointed to specific entries in the timeline. Sarah Chen, marketing coordinator at a medical device company David's firm partnered with. Relationship lasted 8 months before she was suddenly transferred to their Seattle office. Lauren Martinez, pharmaceutical sales rep who worked closely with David on a major account, promoted to regional manager in Denver after their affair ended. Amanda's face had gone pale. "You think he's going to discard me too?" "I think David's pattern is well established," I said gently. "These relationships follow predictable trajectories. Initial professional mentorship, gradual personal involvement, promises of career advancement, and eventually a permanent relationship, followed by sudden endings that coincide with professional relocations or career changes for the women involved. But he said his marriage was already over, that you two were basically just roommates maintaining appearances for professional reasons." The naivety in her voice made my heart ache, despite everything she'd participated in destroying. "Amanda, David and I were actively discussing starting a family just 3 months ago. We'd been looking at larger houses in Evanston with good school districts. Does that sound like a marriage that was already over?" She stared at the laptop screen, scrolling through the evidence with growing horror. "He said you were focused on your career and didn't have time for a real relationship. I worked standard business hours and spent weekends with David whenever he wasn't supposedly traveling for client meetings," I replied. "Meetings that, according to this data, he was actually using to spend time with you and others." Amanda closed the laptop abruptly, as if shutting out the evidence could make it less real. "Why are you showing me this? What do you want from me?" "I want you to make informed decisions about your life and career," I said. "David is charming and persuasive, and he's very good at making women feel special and valued. But his track record suggests that your relationship with him has an expiration date that's probably approaching faster than you realize." "You could be making all of this up," Amanda said, but without conviction. "Trying to break us up out of spite." "I could be," I agreed. "But you're smart enough to do your own research. Contact some of these other women if you can find them. Look at the patterns in David's behavior over the past 6 months. Ask yourself whether his promises about your future together align with his established track record." I stood to leave, then turned back to Amanda one final time. "You're young and talented, and you have a promising career ahead of you. Don't let David Chen derail that by mixing your professional advancement with personal involvement. It never ends well for the women in his orbit." As I walked away, leaving Amanda alone with the evidence of David's systematic deception, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and regret. Satisfaction that she now had the information she needed to make informed choices about her future. Regret that I hadn't been able to save her from the pain of discovering that her relationship with David was just another iteration of his established pattern. My phone rang as I reached my car. David's name on the screen, his third call of the day. "What did you say to Amanda?" he demanded without preamble. "She's been acting strange all afternoon, asking weird questions about my previous relationships." "I told her the truth," I replied calmly. "Something you might consider trying sometime." "Jessica, you can't go around poisoning people against me. Amanda and I have something real, something different from what you and I had." The delusion in his voice was almost breathtaking. "David, Amanda is exactly like what you and I had 8 years ago. You're following the same playbook you've always used, and you're too narcissistic to recognize the pattern." "That's not true." "Ask Amanda about Sarah Chen," I interrupted. "Ask her about Lauren Martinez. Ask her whether she's comfortable being part of a rotation that's been operating throughout our entire marriage. I hung up before he could respond, feeling the same sense of completion I'd experienced after our previous conversation. David's world was beginning to unravel, and the carefully constructed lies that had allowed him to maintain multiple relationships were crumbling under the weight of documented evidence. The drive back to Maria's house gave me time to process the afternoon's confrontations. Rachel's legal strategy would protect my financial interests and ensure David faced appropriate consequences for his misconduct. The conversation with Amanda had planted seeds of doubt that would hopefully grow into the realization that she was being manipulated by someone with a long history of identical behavior. But there was still work to be done. The other women who had been victims of David's pattern deserved to know they weren't alone in their experiences. MedCore Pharmaceuticals needed to understand that one of their senior sales managers had been systematically abusing his position to initiate inappropriate relationships with subordinates and industry contacts, and David himself needed to face consequences that went beyond just the dissolution of our marriage. As I pulled into Maria's driveway, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Amanda. Can we meet tomorrow? I have questions about what you showed me today." I smiled, typing back a simple response. Of course. Same place, same time. The reckoning I'd promised David was just beginning. Amanda was already waiting when I arrived at the park the next afternoon, her usually perfect composure replaced by something raw and uncertain. She looked like she hadn't slept, dark circles under her eyes and her professional polish slightly disheveled. In her hands was a manila folder that she clutched like a lifeline. "I did what you suggested," she said without preamble as I sat down beside her. "I contacted Sarah Chen and Lauren Martinez. I also went through every piece of correspondence I've had with David over the past 6 months." She opened the folder, revealing printed emails, text messages, and what appeared to be handwritten notes. The patterns are identical. Every conversation, every promise, every milestone in our relationship matches exactly what he did with them. I watched as Amanda spread the evidence across the bench between us, her hands shaking slightly as she pointed to specific documents. "Look at this. The same restaurant where he took me for our first real date outside of work. He took Sarah there, too, ordered the same wine, told her the same story about how he'd always dreamed of finding someone who understood his professional ambitions." The methodical nature of David's deception was even more chilling when laid out in comparison format. He hadn't just been improvising his way through multiple relationships, he had developed a systematic approach that he deployed with mechanical precision. "The promises about career advancement," Amanda continued, her voice growing stronger as she processed the evidence. "He told Lauren exactly what he told me about using his connections to fast-track her promotion. He told Sarah the same thing about introducing her to decision-makers in pharmaceutical purchasing. Did he follow through on those promises?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "That's the sick part," Amanda replied. "He did. All of these women got the career benefits he promised, which made them trust him more completely when he started making personal promises. He was essentially trading professional advancement for emotional compliance." The calculated nature of David's manipulation was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence Amanda presented. He had used his legitimate professional influence as leverage for personal relationships, creating a system where women felt obligated to maintain romantic involvement because their careers had benefited from his intervention. "When did you realize the personal relationship was more important to him than the professional mentorship?" I asked. Amanda laughed bitterly. 3 weeks ago, when he started pressuring me to move in with him. He said his marriage was essentially over and that we could start building a real life together. But according to Sarah's timeline, that's exactly when he started pulling away from her. Right around the 3-week mark after making similar promises. She pulled out her phone and showed me a text exchange that made my stomach turn. David had sent Amanda the same message almost word for word that appeared in Sarah's correspondence. "I've never felt this way about anyone before. You make me want to be the man I always knew I could be." Copy and paste romance, I observed. He's literally recycling the same emotional manipulation across multiple relationships. "It gets worse," Amanda said, scrolling to another set of messages. "Last week, he started talking about how you were becoming suspicious and demanding, making his life difficult as he tried to transition out of the marriage. But according to Lauren's notes, he said exactly the same thing about his previous girlfriend when he was trying to justify why he couldn't leave his marriage immediately." The realization that David had been portraying me as the obstacle to his happiness while simultaneously conducting our anniversary dinner charade added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. He had been managing multiple narratives simultaneously, telling each woman what she needed to hear to maintain her emotional investment. "What are you going to do?" I asked Amanda, genuinely curious about how she would process this information. "I'm going to destroy him," she said with quiet certainty. "Professionally, personally, completely. David Chen is going to learn that manipulating people has consequences." The transformation in Amanda's demeanor was remarkable. The vulnerable young woman who had been seeking career guidance had been replaced by someone with the focused determination of someone who had been systematically deceived and was prepared to respond accordingly. "I've already spoken with HR at MedCore," Amanda continued. "They're very interested in the documentation I've compiled showing how David has been using his position to initiate inappropriate relationships with subordinates and industry contacts. Apparently, this violates several company policies related to harassment and abuse of authority." I felt a surge of satisfaction that extended beyond personal vindication. David's actions had consequences that reached into his professional life, where his carefully maintained reputation for integrity and leadership would be scrutinized against evidence of systematic misconduct. "There's something else," Amanda said, her voice dropping slightly. "Sarah and Lauren want to file a formal complaint with the pharmaceutical industry's Professional Ethics Board. David's manipulation of professional relationships for personal gain constitutes a violation of industry standards that could affect his ability to work in pharmaceutical sales." The scope of consequences David would face was expanding beyond anything he had probably anticipated when he planned his anniversary dinner performance. His assumption that he could manipulate multiple women indefinitely without facing accountability was proving catastrophically wrong. "Have you spoken with David since yesterday?" I asked. "He's been calling and texting constantly," Amanda replied, "trying to convince me that you're lying, that you're manufacturing evidence out of jealousy and spite. But the documentation speaks for itself. David's own words, his own patterns, his own timeline of deception." She showed me her phone, which displayed 17 missed calls from David and a series of increasingly desperate text messages. The progression from confident dismissal to panicked pleading told the story of someone watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. "What's your plan?" I asked, impressed by Amanda's strategic thinking despite her youth. "Coordinated exposure," she said with the kind of systematic thinking that reminded me why David had been attracted to her. "Professional competence. Sarah, Lauren, and I are documenting everything and presenting it simultaneously to MedCore, the Industry Ethics Board, and potentially the media if David tries to retaliate or minimize the significance of his actions." The plan was sophisticated and comprehensive, designed to prevent David from controlling the narrative or limiting the consequences of his behavior. Amanda had learned from being manipulated and was applying those lessons to ensure David couldn't manipulate his way out of accountability. "There's one more thing," Amanda said, pulling out a final document from her folder. "David's been using company resources to fund his personal relationships, client dinner allowances, travel expenses, even company car usage for personal meetings. MedCore is conducting a full audit of his expense reports going back 2 years. The financial impropriety added another dimension to David's misconduct that would have serious professional consequences. Using company funds for personal affairs wasn't just ethically questionable. It was potentially criminal fraud that could result in termination and legal prosecution. As Amanda and I concluded our meeting, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Satisfaction that David would face appropriate consequences for his actions. Regret that so many women had been hurt by his systematic deception. But also hope that the collaborative response Amanda had organized would prevent future victims and establish consequences that extended beyond individual relationships. My phone rang as I walked back to my car. Rachel Thompson's name on the screen. "Jessica, we just received an interesting call from David's attorney," Rachel said, her voice carrying barely contained amusement. "It seems David is suddenly very motivated to accept our settlement terms without negotiation." "What changed his mind?" "Apparently, he's facing some professional difficulties that make a protracted legal battle less appealing," Rachel replied. Morrison wouldn't give specifics, but he made it clear that David's priority is resolving our case as quickly and quietly as possible. The timing suggested that Amanda's conversation with HR had already begun generating consequences for David. His calculation had shifted from minimizing financial loss to minimizing professional damage, which gave us significant leverage in negotiations. "How quickly can we finalize everything?" "If David signs the papers we've prepared, we could have a settlement agreement by the end of the week," Rachel said. 70-30 asset split in your favor, acknowledgement of fault, and compensation for emotional distress. Plus, he covers all legal fees and agrees to a non-disclosure clause that prevents him from discussing the details of his misconduct. "Actually," I said, thinking about Amanda's coordinated response plan, "I want to modify the non-disclosure clause. David can't discuss the specific details of our settlement, but I want the right to share information about his pattern of behavior if other victims come forward." Rachel paused. "That's an interesting modification. It protects you while ensuring David can't use confidentiality to hide from future accountability. I like it." "Can you make that change?" "Already drafting the revision," Rachel said. "Morrison's not going to like it, but given David's current vulnerability, I don't think they're in a position to negotiate." After ending the call, I drove to MedCore's Schaumburg office, where I had requested a meeting with Robert Stevens, David's direct supervisor. Stevens had agreed to see me after I mentioned having information relevant to David's professional conduct that the company needed to review. Stevens was a distinguished man in his early 50s who carried himself with the careful authority of someone who had built his career on making difficult decisions. His office overlooked the suburban business park where MedCore had established its Midwest headquarters, and his demeanor suggested he was accustomed to handling sensitive personnel matters. "Mrs. Chen," he said, gesturing for me to sit across from his desk. "I understand you have concerns about David's professional conduct. I have documentation showing that David has been systematically using his position to initiate inappropriate relationships with subordinates and industry contacts," I replied, placing a folder of evidence on his desk. "This behavior spans several years and involves multiple women whose careers have been affected by his manipulation." Stevens opened the folder and began reviewing the documents with the focused attention of someone trained to assess risk and liability. As he read, his expression grew increasingly serious. "These are serious allegations," he said finally. "What outcome are you seeking by bringing this to my attention?" "I want MedCore to understand that one of your senior sales managers has been violating professional ethics and potentially exposing the company to harassment claims and regulatory scrutiny," I replied. "David's actions reflect on MedCore's culture and values, and they create potential liability if they continue unchecked." Stevens nodded thoughtfully. "We've already begun an internal investigation based on information provided by Ms. Foster. The documentation you've brought provides additional context that will be very helpful in our review process." What will that investigation involve? A comprehensive review of David's professional conduct, including his relationships with subordinates, his use of company resources, and his compliance with our ethical guidelines, Stevens explained. Depending on our findings, consequences could range from formal reprimand to termination and referral for prosecution if we discover criminal behavior. The professional accountability David would face was becoming as significant as the personal consequences of his divorce. His assumption that he could compartmentalize his behavior and avoid professional repercussions was proving as naive as his belief that he could manipulate multiple women indefinitely. "There's one more thing," Stevens said, his tone becoming more personal. "I want you to know that MedCore takes these issues very seriously. If David's behavior has violated our policies, he will face appropriate consequences regardless of his sales performance or professional relationships." The assurance was meaningful, though I suspected David's sales performance would suffer considerably once his pattern of misconduct became widely known in the industry. Professional reputation was crucial in pharmaceutical sales, and David's would be permanently damaged by the evidence of his systematic manipulation. As I left MedCore's offices, my phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "How did everything go today? Ready for dinner and debrief?" I typed back, "On my way. Bring wine. Lots of wine." The drive back to Maria's house gave me time to process the day's developments. David's world was collapsing with the same systematic precision he had used to construct his web of deceptions. Amanda's transformation from victim to advocate had catalyzed consequences that extended far beyond our individual relationships. The collaborative response from multiple women had created accountability that David couldn't manipulate or control. But beyond the satisfaction of seeing David face appropriate consequences, I felt something more profound: the recognition that I had rediscovered my own strength and agency. The woman who had sat at that anniversary dinner 3 days ago, confused and hurt by her husband's betrayal, had been replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept manipulation or deception. Maria was waiting with Thai takeout and a bottle of Cabernet when I arrived at her house. We spread the food across her kitchen table, and I told her about Amanda's research, the meeting with David's supervisor, and Rachel's news about the settlement negotiations. "So David's going to lose his job, his marriage, and probably his reputation in the industry," Maria summarized. "That's what happens when you systematically manipulate people who are smarter than you anticipated." "The ironic thing is that David's greatest weakness was his arrogance," I replied. "He genuinely believed he could manage multiple relationships indefinitely because he was convinced he was more clever than everyone around him." "Classic narcissist mistake," Maria observed. "Underestimating other people's intelligence while overestimating your own ability to control complex situations." My phone rang, interrupting our analysis. David's name on the screen, his first call since the morning. I answered on speakerphone, curious about his state of mind after a day of professional reckoning. "Jessica," he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "I need you to call off whatever campaign you're running against me. This has gone far enough." "I'm not running a campaign against you, David," I replied calmly. "I simply provided accurate information to people who needed to understand your pattern of behavior. What they chose to do with that information was their decision. You've destroyed my career, my reputation, everything I've worked for." "You destroyed your career and reputation," I interrupted. "I just made sure the relevant parties had access to factual information about your conduct. If that information is damaging, perhaps you should consider why." There was a long pause before David spoke again, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "What do you want from me, Jessica? What will it take to end this?" "I want you to sign the settlement agreement Rachel prepared. I want you to accept responsibility for your actions without trying to minimize or rationalize them. And I want you to understand that the consequences you're facing are the direct result of choices you made over several years." And if I do, all that, then our legal business will be concluded, and you can focus on dealing with the professional consequences of your behavior, I said. What happens with your job, your reputation, and your relationships going forward will depend on how you handle accountability and whether you're capable of genuine change. After ending the call, Maria and I sat in comfortable silence, processing the strange satisfaction of watching systematic manipulation face systematic consequences. "How do you feel?" Maria asked finally. "Relieved," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of the response. Not just about David facing consequences, but about discovering that I'm stronger and more capable than I knew. This experience forced me to use skills I'd developed professionally in service of my personal life, and it reminded me that I don't have to accept being treated poorly by anyone. 3 weeks later, I signed the final divorce papers in Rachel's office, officially ending my marriage to David Chen. The settlement had been finalized exactly as Rachel had outlined. A 70-30 split of assets in my favor, acknowledgement of David's fault in the dissolution of our marriage, compensation for emotional distress, and a modified non-disclosure agreement that protected my right to share information with future victims while preventing David from discussing the financial details. David had been terminated from MedCore Pharmaceuticals following their internal investigation, which had uncovered evidence of policy violations, misuse of company resources, and inappropriate relationships with subordinates. The Industry Ethics Board had suspended his professional certification pending a formal hearing, effectively ending his career in pharmaceutical sales. Amanda had accepted a promotion to a regional management position with a different pharmaceutical company, removing herself from David's professional orbit while advancing her career on her own merits. Sarah and Lauren had both provided testimony to the ethics board that supported Amanda's formal complaint against David. As I left the law office with my copy of the final settlement, I felt the strange lightness that comes from closing a difficult chapter and beginning something entirely new. The woman who had dressed for an anniversary dinner 3 weeks ago no longer existed, replaced by someone who understood her own strength and refused to accept manipulation as the price of companionship. My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. "Coffee next week. I have news about the new position, and I wanted to thank you for helping me understand what I was really dealing with." I typed back, "Absolutely. Congratulations on the promotion. You earned it." The collaborative response that had emerged from David's systematic deception had created something unexpectedly positive, a network of women who had supported each other through recognition and recovery from manipulation. What David had intended as individual conquest had become collective empowerment. 6 months later, I was settled into my new role as Senior Director of Strategic Marketing at a Chicago-based healthcare technology firm, a position that utilized my analytical skills while allowing me to help companies develop ethical, effective approaches to market development. The irony that my experience uncovering David's deception had enhanced my professional capabilities wasn't lost on me. The Lincoln Park townhouse had sold quickly, and I had moved to a sleek condo in River North that reflected my new priorities: independence, professional advancement, and the kind of clean, uncompromised living space that belonged entirely to me. I still thought about David occasionally, wondering whether he had learned anything from the comprehensive consequences of his actions, or whether he was simply more careful about his next iteration of manipulation. But those thoughts came less frequently and with less emotional charge as time passed, and I built a life based on authentic relationships and genuine professional achievement. The anniversary dinner that had revealed the truth about my marriage had ultimately become the beginning of something better. A life where I refused to accept deception as the price of companionship, and where I used my professional skills in service of my personal integrity. The woman who had confronted David and Amanda at Alinea had discovered that sometimes the most effective revenge is simply living well, while ensuring that manipulative behavior faces appropriate consequences. And that discovery had proven more valuable than any marriage built on systematic lies ever could have been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.